Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here. I think to kick off, I'm going to ask everyone to stand up. Excellent. And if you could just stretch it out and to the side and to the other side. And if you want, you can even go around. And if you feel inclined, if those of you who want to, you can move up. But if you want to stay in the back, that's also okay. But I'm delighted to be here. Yes, everyone can sit down, yeah. I'm delighted to be here. This is a slightly intimidating first day at NeurIPS. When I was invited to give this talk, I felt like I didn't want to give a technical talk. I wanted to give a broader talk, but those tend to be harder because you're more nervous about messing it up. So we'll see how I do. But I want to use this space today with everyone here to just think about something which has been occupying my thoughts for a long time, which is how do we get to ideas? And how do we get to the research paper? I lead Cohere for AI, so we're a research lab. We work on fundamental research. We're also a hybrid lab, so we have both a full-time research staff as well as an open science effort. And we also do a lot of work on AI policy safety. A lot of this has been introduced, like a lot of our fundamental research on areas like efficiency, large language models at scale, hardware-software interaction. And this is what I work on, and this is what I'll be giving several talks on throughout the rest of the week. So feel free, if you're interested in these areas, I'm also happy to talk about them afterwards. But today, I'm going to talk about what happens behind the work that we will talk about for the rest of this week. This is the Monday of a whole week where you're going to be inundated by poster sessions and PDFs. But one thing I like to think about, and maybe I'm suggesting we think about it all together here, is why do some ideas succeed instead of others? What leads to a breakthrough? And who gets to contribute? This is what you'll see this week. I'm not sure, how many people is it their first NeurIPS? Okay, amazing. Yes, so this is a good snapshot of what you may see across the week, as well as many, many papers. It will get to the point where you'll walk past posters and be like, I've had enough, I need to skip this one. And all these PDFs will have the same stamp of approval. This is a huge honor, like for many researchers, when they finally get to present their paper here. It will have been accepted to NeurIPS, which is one of our top tier conferences. But these posters and PDFs will include all the technical details, but they won't tell the story of how they came to be and why some PDFs are a lot harder to get to than others. Today, this talk is about who gets to do research and who gets to be part of breakthroughs. And to start us thinking about this, I think it's worthwhile going back to the past. How did we get here? And who determines what being a researcher means? I will suggest, and this will be my thread throughout this talk, that history tells us that unfortunately, research is an endeavor which is a symptom of surplus. It requires us to have enough surplus to dedicate ourselves to thinking about the future and not just the present. Surplus, so when you think about it, is this idea that we have enough saved up that we don't have to focus on our current needs. And much of research, like art, is about defining the boundary of what comes next. So we're all in this room together, perhaps more dispersed than this visual. Maybe that's why I was asking people to come up. I'm like, it has to fit the talk. And we have this space, we have these facilities, we have coffee and kind of in the middle pastry quality for the rest of the week, but we have the resources to think about ideas for a week. And it's worth thinking about what a remarkable privilege that is, that we bring together researchers from all over the world to think about ideas and to catalyze what comes next. And it's worth thinking about that for most of history, this didn't exist. And what's interesting, I list early Plato academies as like the first moment where there was a dedicated space, but even after that, there was large periods of darkness where there were no dedicated spaces. So this is rare. It's a very small slice of our overall history. So who gets to be in this room? And who gets left out? So traditionally, research requires space and resources to insulate. Even the word academia is derived from academia, the Greek word for the school that Plato set up, which was a physical space where scholars could retreat, where they had the sustenance they need, the infrastructure they need. And we often associate learning with physical spaces, that we go somewhere to study, that we go somewhere to learn, and that we insulate ourselves from our immediate desires to create the space for us to think about the future. In early history, these were spaces that were very associated with religion. These were included madrasas, that included the early cathedral schools. And for example, even papal policy supported this. So the Pope would send clerics to work with royals, and these became the learned scholars of their day. They were able to dedicate themselves to further the field. Although their members were sometimes poor, religious institutions had the surplus in terms of enough wealth and enough stability, because they were often determining the stability of different regions. What's interesting is one of the biggest reminders of the influence of this era is our academic gowns, which are a really nice reference to these early influences of priests in early scholar and cathedral schools. Traditionally, similar to art, our early thinkers depended on patronage or being noble. So Plato was able to finance the first academy because Plato belonged to an aristocratic noble family. Galileo, Leonardo da Vinci depended heavily on patronage. So if you ever want to see a grumpy quote about applying for grants, Leonardo da Vinci had plenty of commentary about having to go to royal courts, and often fell afoul of their initial benefactors, such as where Leonardo da Vinci wasn't actually allowed to be buried with the proper dignity, just because towards the end of his life, his thought process and work was considered ever more controversial. But the 1400s was kind of a pivotal moment because of the printing press. Why was the printing press interesting? Go for it. My timekeeper. I can tell you want to. Yeah, go for it. Yes, it was really pivotal for getting ideas and spreading ideas. Why else? Why does that matter? Increase access. Yeah, more people had access to the ideas and so could weigh in. What else? This is actually a very important point. We'll come to this. So actually, it's funny because there were a lot of grumpy academic disputes because everything was so disjoint. People would write things at different times, and then it was always unclear who was actual. Yeah, but it would also help for interpretability or preciseness of ideas. This is really good. I just want to say, because I find this interesting to think about, so one of the reasons Gutenberg's press was the pivotal moment was that he actually wasn't trained. He wasn't trained to be a press maker. It wasn't like he was doing manuscripts his whole career. He was a metal worker. And so he brought a lot of innovation. And that's one of the reasons it was so successful, because he did this pivot. So for example, because he did metalworking, he was really familiar with how to do the pieces. And he more efficiently created the subset of metal pieces that could be compiled into different letters. But he also used different combinations of oil instead of the more traditional water-based ink. And so this was really innovative for the time, but it's one of the reasons this was a breakthrough. So I always like to think about that. I think sometimes the ability to see the edge of an idea depends on coming at it from a very different field. But yes, everyone was completely right. So this idea of access, it's very profound. We kind of forget about it because now we have the internet, and now we're like, oh, large language models also do this. But it had a profound impact on the speed of information. So European book output rose from millions, a few million, to around 1 billion. But it was also what type of output. So before, it had been primarily all religious texts. And it is true that essentially the first texts that were widely printed were things like the Bible. But by decreasing the cost of production, it meant people started to publish other things. And that's where we get to the interpretability piece, because it also helped establish a community of scientists. who started to use these early journals to communicate ideas. Prior to that, it was slightly eccentric. So it was not unusual for scientists to announce their discoveries through anagram, which is slightly absurd because they were scared of their ideas being stolen, so they would only reveal it to the right person who knew the clues. Highly inefficient and resulted in long, drawn-out attribution battles about who invented what when. But the printing press, because it enabled wider access, also meant that there was much more essentially kind of calibration about who said what and where, and this idea about precision of scientific details. It also meant that the notion of authorship came into play, because now that more people could read your work than a select few, being an author mattered more because it was prestigious. And so people started to focus on the individual author, and it became more lucrative to be the author of a successful text. However, who got to participate in this remained tightly coupled with status and wealth. So there's this fabulous term, gentleman scientist, which describes this new type of researcher. So it wasn't now confined to just religious institutions, but to participate. The name captures a lot. So gentlemen, that you had to be a certain class, and that you were a gentleman. And many of the famous early scientists, but even Albert Einstein, were what we would call gentleman scientists. They used their own wealth to sponsor their research journey, at least initially. And what happened was these started to converge into the first institutions. So royal societies were mainly driven by a desire to separate, to say, we are the scientists and you are not. And in this way, they proved remarkably successful because, for example, the early Royal Society in the UK, everyone wanted to be a part of, but membership was seen as this massive privilege. But it formed the foundation of our current notion of research, where it's solidified around institutions, that you have an affiliation, that on our badges, typically we all have something written there. And if we don't, maybe we scribble something on it. But there's this notion of what is your affiliation? Where are you? What is your spot? Yeah, have things changed? I'm curious. What do people think? Yes. The dissemination of ideas has, in fact, in many ways, continue to exist. And what's interesting is that this is actually very particular to our field as machine learning, which is something that people often forget. We talk so much now about how we're not doing a good job, and I agree, some aspects we're not doing a good job at now, but it was revolutionary at the time that machine learning led the way with things like archive, with things like having insisting on code. And there's still clear failing points, but I think our culture as a community has always been very much to aid that. So I think that's a very important point. Yeah, what else? Anything else? That's true. Yeah, so a proliferation of ideas. By the way, this was the impetus of the early Royal Society. They said we have to have a society to discern, the bad scientists who are doing, kind of fake experiments. I will say a funny historical anecdote. One of the first experiments the Royal Society did was testing whether unicorn horn powder prevented spiders from running out of a circle. So it's not clear to me that they were setting the gold standard either, but I do agree there's this question of how do you maintain really the standards of science, and part of our solution has been things like this room at NeurIPS where we all submit our work, but I agree, it's an interesting aspect. Yeah. Okay, let's think about this. So I would argue that the Royal Society has marked this beginning of time of formalization of the profession of scientists. A new language emerged to describe who is a scientist and implicitly who isn't. Roseanne Liu, who I greatly admire, she founded MLC. She was an old colleague while I was at Google Brain. She describes this as the unreasonably narrow path, that now, as you come into your research career, you have to choose between two things, industry or academia. But for both, somewhat confoundingly, the same rubric applies. And you have to fulfill this very narrow rubric very early in your career. So some of the things that might be on this rubric, are things like having papers before you even go and do a PhD, access to a top-tier PhD program, getting the right top-tier internship in industry, working with the right people who are well-connected and who can connect you, having enough PDFs with your name at the front, enough PDFs where you clearly have enough of the same type of ideas. Because even if you have a lot of PDFs, if you don't have what's called a coherent research agenda, that's also a big question. Having a clear, easy to describe research agenda, getting the right industry role or academic role. And so what's interesting is that we've almost formalized our own set of standards to allocate surplus. And we see this in the people that we consider illustrious on our career. These are slides that Roseanne put together, which I think really illustrate this, the whole notion of how you achieve the frontier of our field. This is Jan's. I guess that should now be 10 years, maybe. I think he just celebrated his decade. And then Zubin, who is at Google. And we see this in who we're supposed to look up to as defining the field. But one thing that I'll say is that what this ends up with is that we just shuffle the same, we consider these two separate paths, but we shuffle the same people between these two paths. And I know this firsthand because a lot of my colleagues do the shuffle. Like they'll go to academia, then they'll come to industry. They'll go within industry. And so we just rotate the same group of people from the same institutions who did the same rubric, who managed to pass through all those requirements. And so we don't use the term gentleman science anymore, but the same notions of privilege and access to resources still apply. So wait. And this is Roseanne's excellent prompts. Who made the rubric? Is it in your favor? And what if you don't fit? The data that we have tells us that this narrow rubric means many people are left out of this room. That when you have these discrete buckets that determines who and how you make this rubric, you end up having to time correctly each step. That you have to start early in undergrad, that you have to be at the right undergrad with the right resources, that you have to access the top tier PhD program. And so what this means is, Sergio's fantastic. I'm just saying hi to him. Yeah. And what this means is that by the time you get to the end, who's left? And so this formalization of science and this definition that we have of what it means to be talented and to be a good researcher is a way to allocate available surplus, frankly. And it's a way for us to still direct formally surplus to a few. We are going through a boom cycle in AI funding, in resources, in research, and the number of publications has increased. But who produces research remains narrow. This is from the Stanford AI Index, and it shows that sub-Saharan Africa produces 1.06% of all publications. Latin America and the Caribbean, 3.57%. This is also reflected in places like NeurIPS. This is also from the AI Index. They did a poll of the WIML workshop, and they included it. 53% of the participants were from North America. So it's actually interesting to think about how many people here traveled more than a day to get here? A lot. Where did people travel from? Like, where are some of the places that people travel from? China? Chile. Both would have been long, yeah. Yeah, it's very long. Yeah, where else? Colombia? Ecuador? Brazil? Korea? Middle East? This is the thing, because rooms like this are so few, and because it's such a privilege to bring people together, we end up asking everyone to come to these rooms. And oftentimes, the burden falls disproportionately on the people who have to travel the furthest, who also tend to be the people who could benefit from rooms like this the most. And that's a really interesting tension. But it's also just the most visible of these tensions. There's things like compute disparity. We're seeing it play out today. This was one of the points made earlier, that it's access to resources and what institutions have access. We're in a bigger is better regime in machine learning, but we see massive disparities in who has compute, with many industry academic collaborations or industry kind of dominating. And who participates in research breakthroughs also determines who makes the breakthroughs. And this is one of the most striking charts from the AI Index report. They define a taxonomy of what makes a significant machine learning system from 2002 through 2022. And it's important to let this sink in. What are they saying? They're saying that no significant machine learning systems came from huge parts of our world. And it also means that technology is, I think Vukosi has a fantastic quote about this, who is one of the organizers of the Deep Learning Endeavor. When you're not part of a conversation, it happens to you and not with you. And so location matters, access matters, surplus matters. It remains one of the most dominant factors determining success in our field. And today we just spoke about the people who are here and how far they traveled. We're also not capturing the people who are not here, who couldn't come because of visa reasons. This is an article from years ago, from 2019. But the fact is, you could write the same article today. Nothing has really changed. And so we end up having these issues of who gets to be in these privileged spaces where we get to think about ideas for a week. So how do you change the rubric? Is there a third way? I'll share a little bit about my journey thinking about the third way. So I did not grow up knowing about computers. My parents met in Sudan. My mom is Irish, my dad is English. My mom is a teacher, my dad's an engineer, and we moved a lot. So we were in Lesotho, Mozambique, Eswatini, Kenya, they were in Liberia. But I grew up wanting to be an economist for the World Bank. For me, that was the most technical person I knew. I just thought it was so exciting to be able to say something about the trends and give these tools that could have this real applied impact. And when I was 19, I got a scholarship to go to the US, to Minnesota of all places. But I remember my dad saying, I think it's good you're going to the US because you dream so big. And I feel like that will be a place where you can have a lot of different opportunities to think about these things. And he was right. The US opened a lot of doors to me. I went to snowy Minnesota, which was, I had a host family. It was like an amazing 4 years. And then I went to the Bay Area. I was still doing my dream of becoming an economist. I was working on antitrust cases, doing modeling. But at the same time, at the time in the Bay, it was such an exciting time to really engage in the wider ecosystem. I had started this thing called Delta Economics, which someone I think was mentioned in the introduction. It's still this brilliant organization, has nothing to do with me now. There's just amazing people still involved. But at the time when we started it, we're like, oh, let's bring economic models to nonprofits. It turns out economic models are maybe not what nonprofits need. No slight to economists in the room, but in the process, I was working really closely with a lot of different engineers, and I just became obsessed. I'm like, wow, this is such a powerful set of tools to model the world. I want to talk about this moment of like the first door that opens that takes a bet on you is the most important one. So I joined Udemy, which was a small startup at the time. Now it's quite big. Some of you may have heard of it. It's now public. But when I joined as an analyst. I already knew I was obsessed and I wanted to really work on modeling. Oh, I'm being told off. It's okay. Yeah, we'll figure. And I started working on really these ideas of like, how do we model these different courses? And I was also working in the mornings before work, all my weekends, and also just coding for different nonprofits. The VP of engineering took a bet on me and allowed me to transfer into the engineering team. And it's a bet that changed my life. They took a bet on me before I was good enough. but with the belief that I would become good enough. And it was brute force, but I did it. And I was one of the first people on the machine learning engineering team. I deployed their first algorithms and recommendation. But I just want to remind that so much of this depends on someone taking that first door to open for you. After that, something else happened that was really meaningful. The timing, I had since was working at Udemy on recommendations, was teaching machine learning, and the timing opened up. The second ever cohort of the brain residency program, which no longer exists, but there was second ever iteration, opened up, and I was accepted. And it again opened all these doors for me that I didn't know would exist. I want to talk about this because 7 years ago, I joined Google Brain, which seems so crazy. I don't know, it's so interesting. And I felt a few years in like I had achieved the finish line by certain rubrics. I published papers that were widely respected. I had accumulated PDFs. I had the trust of my colleagues and collaborators. But in the process, I kind of realized a few years in that I had lost myself. And in some ways, I was trying to fit someone else's rubric of what was important in our field. Because when someone else designs a rubric, it also means you have to fit that definition of what is important. You have to squeeze in. But sometimes once you get there and you realize, wow, I've done it, I'm well respected, I have these papers, I've done NeurIPS, I've presented, you realize you may have lost something in the process. While I was at Google Brain, I started to explore whether there's a third way. I wanted to find, well, now that I've done this and shown I can do this, it's important I figure out how to do this journey in a way that's meaningful for me. I decided to take more risks. I worked with Sergio and Pablo, who's not here, to start this program called Cohere, which is so special and took so much work. But these papers were working with first-time authors from around the world. I also worked on papers that felt meaningful to me that no one would have told me to work on at the time, like the hardware lottery. But I felt like I need to choose questions which interest me and which feel profound to me. I want to talk about this. This is perseverance, not just entering spaces, but changing spaces. You see, we've talked about these two significant changes that make the timing ripe for a revolution in who, where, and how research is done. One is that we're not as bound to physical spaces as we once were. The second is that access to information has only increased. This is what was said, I think, from this side of the room, this idea that we have done even better at disseminating information. For most of computer science history, progress has taken place in a very narrow set of spaces, academia. However, we're now in the most exciting period. More has happened in the last 10 years or 20 years, however you want to count it, than all of modern computer science history. So it's important we change the spaces where, how, and by whom research is done. And this question of how we collaborate is intrinsic to understanding and accelerating scientific progress. Often, how we collaborate is both how we'd like to collaborate, but how we're incentivized to collaborate. And sometimes these changes in collaboration can spark these evolving incentives. So 2 years ago, I left Google Brain, where I really enjoyed working on research. I mean, the good thing is Google Brain also left, so I feel like it wasn't so traumatic a goodbye. But to take a leap and lead this research lab, C4AI, which is motivated by changing how we do research. I want to share something I'm really proud of. So this is one of the first hybrid labs, but something I'm proud of is that in 2023, we published 32 papers, and we did it in a cross-institutional way. Most of our papers are with outside institutions. We collaborate across 40 plus institutions, and we welcomed 1,300 independent researchers from around the world. We also did something which I remember one professor at the time, I was asking for advice, and they said, I'm not sure this is possible while still contributing research that's publishable. They were quite down on the idea, but I said, I think talent is global, and I think we should create this research scholar position which gives resources as an industry role, but brings in the best talent from all over the world. And all the scholars, these are incredible cohort, and they all published this year. Actually, a few of these papers are at NeurIPS this week, so please stop by. But I want to end with this. I'm going to skip this stuff. You can come ask me about Cohere for you afterwards. But I want to talk about this because I think it's important. I gave this talk about a year ago when Cohere for AI was just getting off the ground. But I actually think I want to change it. And I didn't give this personal talk, but I did talk about why I thought it was important to change these spaces. But I want to add an important caveat in this talk, which is that I think speaking about perseverance alone does a disservice to our mission of changing how research is done. And I'm a few years into this journey of trying to create a third way. And I want to end with this warning, which is that if it only falls on a few organizations to change a rubric while everyone else sticks to this traditional narrow path, we have failed. Because the truth is, it takes so much work to change how research is done. Not all PDFs are created equal, and some PDFs are changing who participates in our field. At the end of the day, we all show up here, and everything's treated equal. And all these works are treated the very same here. And this is my fear, is that organizations like Cohere for AI, RIA, Kipu, Masakani, MLC do the hard work that organizations with far more resources do not want to. And I think that we have to be very precise and use rooms like this to articulate this, because it is so much work and we need the incentives to change, not just organizations, individual organizations. Because when we change the ratios, and that we change the ratios, but the rubric remains the same. And so we let more people into rooms that are not designed for them. So what do I want? I think I'm going to leave you with some grumpy requests. Not that this room has to solve it, but I think these are the moments where we have to be grumpy and say, what should we change at a more aggregate level? So one is compute programs should not be global, not national. We have a compute grant program. It's a Band-Aid. We need more institutional resources for compute. And PDFs are not created equal, and we should acknowledge that. We should have awards the same way we have a Test of Time award to acknowledge the papers that go far beyond at broadening the mediums and the way in which we produce research. Academic institutions funded by governments should have a certain quota of spots that are allocated to researchers who have not previously published. We should not make getting into a PhD program having 3 papers already. Industry intern positions should not be restricted to PhD students. This is absurd, and there's too many talented researchers around the world. And grants should not be restricted based on having an academic affiliation. National programs and government should allocate dedicated funding to preserving cultural heritage and machine learning. We just did IRE for a year, and this is now, data matters. What data is captured and who it reflects matters. We need systematic institutional support for this. I know I'm over. Everyone's being very polite. But here's the real thing, is that you may disagree with some of these, you may agree with others, you may think some are not feasible, but we should be having this conversation, because it shouldn't just be on these rooms to solve these issues. And it shouldn't just belong to a few institutions to be a Band-Aid for a wider problem. And I realize it's just not enough, because it's too much work. And we need to change things at the institutional system level as well. We need institutional support for redefining what it means to be a scientist. We are no longer in the era of the gentleman scientist. We are no longer in the era of the rigid rubric, and we should update our values as a community to reflect. My last challenge is for you. So everyone's in this room. Do not forget to reshape the room as you go. I think sometimes we're so focused on showing we fit that we forget to reshape it, and we forget who we are in the process. So do not forget who you are and where you came from and how far you came, because I never would have said growing up this is where I'd be. So I think it's really important that we don't forget what we bring. And with that, I'll stop for questions if I have time. Maybe I don't. Yeah, thank you.
I have something that is more of a comment than necessarily a question.
Excellent.
Going back to the comment that you made about like everyone having to like come here and like travel, and it's like the effort is completely disproportional. I think a lot of the let's say challenges in having like more inclusion is that a lot of the privileged people, they have like a very, very hard time like even realizing or thinking about of how the other people that are not as privileged have to like put more effort in like being part of this group. I remember that in 2017, AMAS was in Brazil, and it was one of the first conferences to be in South America, one of like the major AI conferences. There was one in Argentina some years before, but this one of the first ones to be in South America. And there were like a lot of people, like especially Europeans and Americans, like complaining like crazy, like saying, I had to fly for like 10 hours to get here. And like, this is completely absurd. I had to spend a lot of money in a flight ticket. No, like, let's have those conferences just in the US and in Europe. And I was like, okay, you are here in my city. I have to fly 19 hours every time, like 4 times a year, whenever I go to a conference. So it's quite hard because like the people who like have the privileges and were usually like the ones that are leading the fields and have like more power, they like have a lot of like I don't know, like challenges in like just like observing the challenges that the other people have to go through. And it's even like way smaller effort for them to go to like South America, to Africa, whatever, because they have the money from the university. It's just a matter of like a little bit of more time to get there, which is not the reality from someone from like South America or Africa, that usually, even if you have the paper, the university cannot afford to send you there.
Yeah, I'll just add to that ICLR this year, people didn't show up. It almost drove, I mean, I don't know how much of this is public, but I would ask the ICLR organizers the fiscal strain that conference put on them because people decided not to come because it was in Kigali, Rwanda. And this is crazy.
Thanks, Sara. I'll add a question for you. I love what you've done with Cohere over the past few years. If the typical question, if you could go back and change one thing in your path for where you are today with Cohere, what would that be?
Is that a typical question? That's a really hard question. No, I think that things inform us for a reason, right? I think that often we feel like we have to get to the point of being respected by your peers to say that this is not the rubric I want to play by. It's very interesting. I see that as well in terms of how we have to justify change. Often the most effective change makers try and show you can do something different within the same rubric rather than just try and deviate completely. And it's really interesting. It's this tension I think about a lot. But sometimes I think that we have to go through these moments to realize who we are amongst everything. You have to reach your imaginary finish line to be like, this actually isn't my finish line. This isn't the type of research community that I think we should have. And so it's all important. I will say, I think that taking the leap to Cohere was very scary for me when I left Google Brain, because in some ways I felt so supported there. But I'm really proud that we did that because it has been a mission which so many people have joined. And so I always say, if you're thinking about a leap in your career, and over the course of your research career, you're going to have to do. So the interesting thing about research is that we have to have courage, right? Because we're establishing the new frontier of what ideas exist. But sometimes we hesitate when it comes to life choices. And I think that remember always that what drives you as a researcher is that you have to care about the work that you work on because it takes too much effort. But then also, if something is going to put you back in the deep end and you're going to learn a lot from it, you should always go for it. Because what matters the most is, do you have the freedom to work on what you care about, as well as do you enjoy who you work with? And I feel like that's what's guided my career throughout each step of the way. And yeah, I think that's why it was hard to leave Brain in parts, because I had a very special group of people I worked with there. But you have to stress test in order to figure out what in order to grow as a researcher and as a person. So this has been a special chapter, and I'm being kicked off, but I'm happy to chat after this. Oh, sorry, pardon me.